So welcome again, guys, to the platform. Great to have you with us. As I said, we're at the end of this series in which we've been talking around pretty big questions. Now, if you've joined us either in our Sunday morning community or here at the platform over the last 3 weeks, then you'll know we've been talking about something that we've titled for the last 2 years, Ghosts Upon the Earth. Now, that is a metaphor that helps us to frame a conversation around some of the most difficult things that we can talk about in our current context, our contemporary climate in the world we live in, but also the stuff that is probably the least talked about in church. Some of the things that you've probably heard the least about in this Christian community, which is perhaps some of the things that we need to hear the most about, because they're the things we struggle with the most. And we focused this conversation on mental health issues, particularly through the last 3 weeks, burnout, stress, and exhaustion, stuff that's so typical of the culture that we live in. Now, as we close off a series at the platform, this is something that we started in September and will continue on. We want, at some point in each series, probably at the end of most, to create space for something that we're calling Q&A, and that actually stands for Question the Answers, a place in which you guys get to do a little bit more work deconstructing some of the things that you've heard. We said through this series, at no point in a conversation on mental health should you ever find yourself listening to easy answers to impossible questions. You shouldn't find yourself hearing easy diagnoses for incredibly difficult and controversial problems. What we do want to do tonight, though, is actually give you guys space to ask some questions. Now, what you're going to see throughout the evening is a number on screen. It's actually my phone number, so don't bug me after the service. Let's just make a commitment and a covenant here that you'll only text me now, unless it's really important. So the number's going to be on screen throughout the conversation tonight. David and I are going to have a little bit of a chat for the next little while, and we hope that will frame a little bit of a thought process for you. We hope that will create an environment in which you find your own imaginative juices flowing and you want to ask some questions as well, whether they be very conceptual about mental health issues, or probably more specifically, whether those be questions about friends that you have, or maybe your own struggles that you haven't had space to ask before. So I encourage you to text in your questions throughout the night. We're going to close off our evening instead of the usual table talk around our tables, in which we'll actually have those questions going on screen. And even though it's my number, they will stay absolutely anonymous, I promise. In fact, I'll delete them afterwards, all right? How about that? So we'll make another agreement there, but only if you agree not to text me. So tonight, as we close off this series, we're closing off the same series that we have done this morning, and that's why I've invited our teaching pastor, David Harvey, to join us. Would you welcome David with me? Thank you. Okay, that was a little bit over the top. I was looking for a sort of 2 to 3 second ovation, but that's fine. That's fine. David, thanks so much for joining us. Really glad to have you with us, and we're really glad to have you helping us frame this conversation around some of the most difficult things that we can talk about in church. Before we jump in any further, I thought I'd just ask you, why is a series on mental health questions so important to us? This is the second year, at least, we've done it in our Sunday morning community. Last year, we talked about some big pieces around depression, anxiety, fear. And we thought that this was, for some reason, important enough and elicited enough of a response that we want to talk about it again. So why do we want to do that in a context like church?
Well, I can't really afford my own therapist, so this is like just an easier way for me to work out my own troubles, really.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
Well, actually, and I say that, just to maybe lighten a tough conversation. For me, the journey of a series like this is quite a personal one. And if people have connected with any of our podcasts from last year and this year, I've tried as best as I find myself able to, I suppose, to be kind of transparent. And there's also there's a kind of autobiographical sense to me working through a series like this. So my own journey of life involves me wrestling with predominantly issues of anxiety, but I'm trying to sort of figure out how those are both a product of who I am at some level, but also a product of the culture and the society that we are creating around ourselves, really. And I think for me, that's been a really fascinating journey in my own head at some level to sort of try and figure out why do I process the way that I process. And then when I found the courage, I suppose, and it's difficult to say courage about your own thing, but when I found the courage to talk to people, what I've always been overwhelmed about is that, your great fear about any vulnerable moment is that you stand up and say, hey, this is what I'm struggling with, and everybody just looks at you blankly and says, well, I have no idea what you're on about. And what I've found, however, is that when I do talk about this, invariably what I've found is I've been overwhelmed by people then coming back and saying, Oh, well, actually, your journey is very similar to my journey. So, but then theologically speaking, and it'd be wrong of me to ever not begin a sentence like that somewhere in a conversation like this, what has really struck me in the process of, I'm a researcher, so I'm looking through stuff and trying to make sense of stuff. What struck me is how much this kind of, and I'm beginning to think of it as almost an epidemic of mental health concern that's going on in Western society, is being created by our world. So I think that's true of our depression and anxiety. There's part of me fights saying that because I want to fight a little bit the temptation to try and make sense of these things, because I don't think you can make sense of some of them. I genuinely think it's possible in the same way as it's very difficult to make sense of why one person gets cancer and another person doesn't. I also think the same is true of anxiety and depression and mental health issues, that they're not easy to track. But I think you can see connections, and so our society is requiring things of us. And it struck me even more so as we've researched this series, that stress and then the effects of stress, the anxieties, the depression, the suicide, all these sort of things that are connected to that, are part and parcel of the way that we're trying to live. So therefore, theologically for me, this is important, because as soon as we start to look at stress, and like the series we've been teaching Sunday mornings is, how do you get off that train? How do you start saying, I'm not so worried about what other people think of me? You realize you're in a countercultural movement now, and so for us as a church with an upside down crown, which I think is this, and I say this all the time, but I really think it's important, a reminder that maybe the way that the whole world is in need of correction, is in need of guidance, and is in need of help. So for me, why should a church say this? Well, people are suffering, people are struggling, people don't know what to do, but also I think because a lot of the answers that we are being given by society are not actually dealing with the problem. It strikes me that there's a lot of advice out there on how to cope with the stress in your own life. Very, very small amounts of the advice that I've been able to bump into have been people saying, maybe there's something wrong with, maybe you need to get a new job, maybe you need to not take that promotion, maybe you need to live in a smaller house, maybe you need to not have quite as cool a car. So I think there's a role of the church to sometimes speak into a broken society and actually say there's maybe a better way to live that might not cure your anxiety and your depression and stress, but it might not make it worse. So for me, that's why it's important work.
I think that's true. The first week of our series here, we talked about burnout culture, and that was really capturing that idea of, look at how efficient they are. The words were barely out of my mouth, and someone had put it on the screen. It's quite impressive. You'd think it was scripted, but it actually isn't. David, and that was a really interesting idea as I was kind of studying around this series, was stress, exhaustion, maybe even anxiety, to an extent depression, are syndromes that we've created ourselves, and so it becomes very, very difficult to prescribe anything for them. And so I've found that actually if you go to your local Indigo, you'll find the self-help section far overshadows the kind of traditional religion or theology section. And that's probably because we find a great attraction to kind of little prescriptions that help us to get through the daily grind of the problem without ever actually getting to the root. And you find this with Jesus all the time, that he's utterly unwilling to just work at surface level. That he heals someone and then he invites them to follow him, and actually it's a radical upturning of their whole life. Or he decides that actually to talk about a woman's sin in the categories of adultery or not adultery isn't good enough. Actually he wants to get the root of saying, I want her whole life to orbit around the real story that actually she's saved by grace. And that's a profoundly difficult thing for us to work through as a culture when we're saturated by it everywhere we look. Now, something that you talked about, I think, last week in our Sunday morning community, was how much of this cultural idea of burnout is actually rooted in something you called the stress of should. I wonder if you can talk a little bit to that, and why this piece around why we hear the word should so much in our society. A therapist friend of mine says that it's by far the most often heard word in a therapeutic context between a counselor and someone being counseled is this word should. I should have done this. Maybe I should change something. And there's this incredible pressure to say, actually, if there's something wrong with my life, it always comes down to me to make a change. And you talked a little bit to to that. Can you say a bit more about what you meant by that?
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting subject area for us to wrestle with. It strikes me, and I'm just thinking back through the teaching that you've done here on Sunday evenings. It strikes me how uninventive we are as humans. Let me just say this by way of sort of intro to this thought, that so you taught that your Heretic series just earlier on this year, and we go back to 500 years ago, and which it strikes me how fascinating this connection is. So we go back to 500 years ago, and we pick out this character called Martin Luther, and we say he did incredible things for the church, incredible things theologically. But here, let me frame it like this, and people can go back and watch the podcasts of your Heretic series to track a bit more of this. This guy comes along, and he says to the church, you are setting impossible demands for us. We can't keep these demands. They're theologically beyond us. And actually, I'm looking at Scripture. This is a broad summary of Martin Luther, isn't it? And I can't see God doing this. God doesn't seem to demand these things from us. He isn't requiring this from us. So instead, what we get is this message of grace, that God loves you as you are and has done everything for you in advance. And so then I read something just in the process of researching this latest series where somebody said that psychology is the new theology. And that the human sort of quest, which has become very introspective. 500 years ago, we were thinking about where's God. Now we're trying to think about where's me. But it strikes me that we haven't actually moved on that much. There's still something out there. It used to be the church until Luther, but now it's society saying, here's our standards, here's our demands, here's what we require for you. And what we find then is we're driven by an age-old problem that just keeps presenting it to ourselves in different language and in different ways, whether it was the church, whether, you and me can go right the way back to English history when it was the king. Somebody was demanding more from you than you were able to give. Mm-hmm. You can trace this right way back to, early religious movements, in the sort of, pre-Iron Age, where people were giving up their children because something out there required more from them than they had to give. And I think one of the most humbling things is for us to maybe accept that we think we've advanced a lot as a human race, but we just keep moving our gods. And now it's become this idea of success, that what should you have in your life, Adam? You should have this type of success. It should form its way in, what sort of job do you have, and what sort of university do you need to go to get that job, and therefore what sort of grades do you need at school to get that particular place at that particular university, because that'll get you this job. And we're pursuing this idea that there's something out there that will make us happy. And which is exactly the same thing as the caveman did, as the pre-Iron Age religious festivals happened, as before Luther we were doing with the church. If I can just satisfy this other thing out there, then I'll be happy. But what we're finding is there is no satisfaction to that. And every generation, it seems, every century or so, it seems to take humans a while to catch up to this, that actually this isn't making us happy, this is killing us. Yeah. So I tried to phrase this around this idea of this overwhelm of should, this stress of the word should. That what it does is it haunts us at some level, if I can use language from our series, because you can't rest, because there's always something you should be doing. And I think to speak directly to our culture here in Calgary, I think there's a sickness about us, and I'm aware of my foreignness when I say this, but I could say the same thing of Manchester, where I've spent the last 10 years prior to moving here. But there's a sickness about us that always feels like there's something else, whether it's an extra course at uni, whether it's an extra promotion we need to be seeking at work, right through to what are you doing with your vacation time, where are you going, how exciting is it? There's this constant drive that increasingly what we're hearing from people, both around the world but also in our cities, it's really hard to just to relax, to actually be satisfied. And now again, as a Bible scholar, we know so much of the Bible speaks to this sense of contentment and satisfaction, that there's something about God who understands that if we can't find that contentment and satisfaction, we will drive ourselves to really unhealthy places.
Yeah, and of course the power of the should is that we don't live in a vacuum. Our driving force is probably hard for us to ever understand the extent to which our intentions and our aspirations in life are actually shaped by how much we compare ourselves to other people. And this is something else that you talked about on, this morning and last Sunday as well. This idea of kind of comparison, how much we tend to compare ourselves to other people, and how that really drives us into almost pathologies of measuring ourselves against the people all around us. And it's actually fascinating to see how we do that differently. It's probably a cliche in church world to talk about us in here and the materialistic world outside these walls. Actually, there's an infinite variety of ways in which we compare ourselves. It's the funniest things, and the things in which we put our value. But I wonder if you can speak a little bit to how much that actually shapes why we feel that we need to live an extremely stressed and fast-paced life. How much is that shaped by comparison? And if so, why is this sense of comparison to others so predicated on our achievements? We find less comparison taking place around happiness. This person is happier than I am. This person is more content than I am. Generally, the categories of comparison that we use and that we develop these deep obsessions around are something that they have achieved that we have not yet achieved. And so, of course, that drives our move forward into stress and exhaustion because we don't ever at any point seem to really compare ourselves to people in healthy categories. I wonder if you can speak a little bit to why that's such a cultural piece for us. Why is it such a huge part of the story of the Western culture?
Yeah, I mean, Leon Festinger was the first psychologist that I'm aware of that pushed this idea of the social comparison theory. And there's some real fascinating nuances to it, that we don't compare ourselves with everyone, right? Actually, which you would naturally assume, social comparison is me comparing myself with this broad range of people, except strangely what we notice amongst us as humans is that's not how we work. So people that are inordinately richer than you don't bother you that much. They're out there, but they're in a different league from me. And people that are inordinately poorer than you, they don't actually bother you that much. And I realize that as also the missions pastor at Westside, you might want to pick me up on that. But,
Sure.
We'll come back to that. This is just fascinating, right? What's fascinating is that we are in most competition with the people who are very similar to us. There might be 4 blocks away, the really expensive houses, but that's 4 blocks away. What I'm interested in is who lives in my street or moves in my network. Now, here's a fascinating thing as well in that think about this, competition doesn't help us build relationship, right? You and me in competition with each other, we don't become better friends as a result of that. It actually draws us away from each other, which I can't help but think is fascinating. Let me phrase it a different way. The people that I could most easily build community with are the people I'm most likely to be destructive towards in terms of my relationships with them. It's very hard for me to build community with the people at the other side of the world who are inordinately poorer than me, and very hard for me to build community with the people that are inordinately richer than me. But the people that I could build community are the people I'm most frustrated by, right? Because they're that little bit better. And it strikes me then, if we could build community well amongst each other, we would realize how much we're all in the same boat, that we're all doing better in some areas and worse in other areas. But when we keep the distance, we're able to build up a kind of pseudo-perception of the other person. So I see, and this is the way our brain selectively processes, I see all the things that you're doing that are great, that are a little bit better than the things that I'm doing. What I don't see, and it's something to the way that we perceive things, I don't see all of the areas where I'm actually doing better than you, right? So I make this false equation, oh my goodness, look how Adam is doing. So then things like jealousy and all that sort of thing moves in, which keeps that distance, which allows me, and this would be how I would phrase it then, allows me to live in this lie that I have a lot to do in order to keep up with you. Right? And I become increasingly convinced that if we could get the people we are most in competition with in rooms together and get them honestly talking to each other, we'd realize that it's true both ways around. That both people are looking at each other, seeing how that journey's going and perceiving the other person to be doing much better than they are, but missing out that they've got the area that they're not doing so well in. So I think there's something, stress, and at some level, and I don't want to minimize these, but at some level, well, actually, let me state this. This is, I think, factual. all mental health is made more difficult. All mental health issues are made more difficult in isolation, right? The worst thing for a depressive, a person with anxiety, a person struggling with suicide, a person overly stressed, the worst thing is to be alone, right? That always makes it worse. But the one thing that our competition does is forces us into loneliness. It forces us away from one another. So it's a really evil circle if you think about it, because the thing we actually need is to be together, but our competition pushes us further and further apart. And therefore stress starts to self-generate in that sort of context. I don't know if that is a helpful way to think about it.
And that's fantastically exacerbated by the dawning of social media.
Oh, goodness,
I was talking to a friend just this week who kind of pointed out how fascinating it is that in this comparison complex that takes place, the social comparison theory is so much more expounded because I compare myself as I know myself to truly be to the best version of the person that I see on social media. I don't know that person. I don't know especially if this is really how they look, or if this is really how they spend their time, or if they really go up the mountain every day and get someone to take a picture of them standing with their arms raised. I don't know if that's really what every day looks like for them, but that's all I have to compare myself to. And so you end up not only comparing yourself to people who historically would at very least be within your network, as you said, but now it's people who are within your network, but you don't really know them anymore. You only know them by the distance of social media. You see them through the kind of rose-tinted lens of your cell phone, and it makes it very, very difficult because this sense of anxiety and this sense of social isolation is exacerbated to say, that person is so much happier than I am. That person is so much more successful than I am, without ever at any point realizing the person that they are offering to the world is the very best version of themselves. And as much as mental health issues are exacerbated in isolation, our sense of isolation is exacerbated when we only show people the best version of ourselves. It doesn't lend itself to community. And that's one of the great beauties and joys of Christian community historically, is an ability to say we can be vulnerable to one another. We can actually say that instead of comparing ourselves to one another, let's at very least level the playing field and be honest with each other. Let's be vulnerable to one another. Well, I want to actually create a space in this moment, especially before we jump in a little bit more and before we take some of the questions that have come in through text, to actually give you guys about 5 minutes around your tables to ask this question. I think we've got a question prepared around this comparison piece. Yeah, so I want to give you guys 5 minutes to talk about this, and hopefully, again, that'll get your imagination pumping a little bit so you can text in more questions as they come. In what ways do we regularly compare ourselves to others? So hopefully you've picked up through the last 3 weeks and then tonight that we're doing a little bit of diagnosing of the problem. How did we get to where we are today? Why is this not just a problem for some people? Why is mental health questions, particularly around burnout, stress, exhaustion, seemingly an epidemic in the culture in which we live? But before we jump into your questions tonight, and I remind you again, keep texting your questions in. We're excited for those. We want to have a few minutes to actually talk about maybe there's a way that we can respond. We don't want to offer easy answers to impossible questions, but we do want to suggest that if there is a way to respond to things that are culturally so huge and we're so saturated by, then maybe the response is hidden somewhere in this old story of Jesus, somewhere in Scripture that we've been digging into together over the last 3 weeks. We've talked about things like silence, solitude, Sabbath, these ancient practices that have something really surprising to say to our very 21st century problems. David, you talked, I think it was last week, about this little story of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. I think we have it coming up on the screen just to remind us, and I'll read that for us, as a little bit of an example of how Jesus responds very differently to burnout. It's probably tempting to think that Jesus' life was a little bit of a walk in the park, or maybe the ancients didn't quite get as burdened under busy schedules as we 21st century types do. And actually this story is a really good reminder to us that Jesus' life was, if anything, pretty hectic. So the story says this: that evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. So suffice it to say that little phrase there, after sunset, Jesus has had a long day. You know, the Gospel of Mark starts with this amazing chapter of just giving us an insight into Jesus' daily agenda. And he starts in the synagogue early in the morning and teaches. Then he heals someone who comes in. And then he goes to his friend Peter's house and heals his mother-in-law. And then before he knows it, the whole town gather at the door. So this is after sunset that the entire town come to Jesus. So let's assume that he's there for a little while, unless he did some sort of mass healing. And I'm not sure that was really Jesus' MO. He's taking time with everyone, with the sick, the demon-possessed. He's letting the whole town pass through his busy schedule. And then there's this amazing little phrase, very early in the morning while it was still dark. So the gospel writer, what he's doing is saying the sun's gone down and Jesus' busyness is just beginning. The sun is not yet up and Jesus is creating space to come away from his schedule and rest. Not rest as a way to recharge his batteries, not rest to just get away from the noise and the crowd, but to rest in the sense of creating a very intentional, attentive space to be present to his Father. David, as you kind of deconstructed this last Sunday, what does this story tell us about the very different way that Jesus responds to things like burnout and stress? Because it's tempting to pull off a self-help book and say, if only I can get through Monday, and then a different book for Tuesday and Wednesday. If only I can find some sort of remedy that keeps me going in the rat race. And Jesus has this radically different way to respond to that. What does this story tell you about that?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important observation, that the self-help books are, without trying to kill themselves entirely, but the self-help books are always ultimately trying to deal with how you survive this rat race, exactly as you say it there. And I think that requires our cultural alertness to be switched on. That if the problem is the rat race itself, then the self-help books aren't going to help you, because they're just, they're just about surviving a system that's broken. And I think it's important for us sometimes to speak to that. And actually, what we're not trying to do is how do you cope with this world. Actually, sometimes the call is to say there's something really wrong with this, and we need to, jam a spoke in the wheel, or at least for our own self, jump off the train. This story fascinates me because of there's a whole host of things that fascinate me. I've reflected on this story for a lot of years. It fascinates me how undriven Jesus is by the things that we would assume he would be driven by. Jesus, all the way through Mark's gospel, actually. Mark does something fascinating where he sets you up in the early chapters, trying to give you a bit of an insight as to what to expect from Jesus. Nobody ever gets it. Like, one of the amazing things about Jesus is not how amazing Jesus is, that is amazing, but how stupid everybody else around him seems to be. Like, Mark is like a whole gospel of people not quite getting the point. Like, his disciples are always with him, and they don't get it. And so the people want this miracle-working Jesus. They want him to sort of do all of the right stuff. And Jesus has a different agenda that one of the things you can do when you track Jesus in this story is see how he's not being governed by the demands and expectations of everyone else. He's being governed by something slightly different. Strikes me as fascinating that, as you say, it's dark by the time he's finished his work. It's dark when he gets back up again. Which strikes me that what we're not talking about is sleep. When we're talking about rest, sleep is a problem for us in the contemporary world. We don't sleep enough. But it's not about how tired Jesus is. It's about where he's investing himself in, So he gets up earlier and finds a solitary place. But this is not enforced solitude and loneliness. This is him, at some sense, ensuring. For me, when I read this story, it's Jesus ensuring that he does what he needs to do in order to be what he knows he's called to be. And if you read the story on, the next sentence, the disciples come finding Jesus, and the disciples work in this story like what the world does to us, what society does to us. They come back with the demands, like, where are you, Jesus? What are you doing resting? What are you doing finding solitude? There's all these other people that need healed, And you get this stunning sentence from Jesus that is so quick that you almost wouldn't get it, where Jesus says, well, actually, let's go somewhere else. So there's all of this demand, there's all of this need, and that's a really subtle thing. It's not that Jesus says they're all fakers, they're not really sick. Right? There is demand, there is need, there is things to do, but Jesus then has this beautiful line where he says, but we're going to go there because we have to do, in Jesus' his answer is, we have to proclaim the kingdom of God. And then he throws out this line, because that's why I've come. Right? And it strikes me that what happens with society and life is the stress sneaks up on you. As a pastor, for more years than I'd like to admit now. It amazes me, and so I've pastored since I was in my early 20s. I'm in my late 30s now. I taught at seminary for 9 years, and one of the things I used to say regularly to my seminary students was, having seen this in pastoral life, be careful of how quickly you get sucked in. At 23, you have all these dreams, and I'll just pick up this job which will keep me going for the time being. And then the stresses of that job mount up, and all of a sudden 10 years are gone, and you wake up in your mid-30s and go, oh, this isn't what I'm about. This is what isn't what I set out to do. If the 20-year-old version of me could find me now, he'd sort of hit me with a 2x4, because I'm so far off track. And it strikes me that this is the threat for Jesus. Like, this is a great ministry you got going here, Jesus. There's ill people, there's sick people, you can heal them. Let's get on with that. And because of this solitude, because of this rest, and rest always does this, if you do it properly, it reminds you of who you are. That Jesus is able to look at the demand, the stress, the requirements, and say, yeah, that's not what I am. That's not what I'm. It's good work, but it's not what I'm called to do. Yeah. And I wonder how many of us simply not stopping is the thing that allows us to keep going down unhealthy paths. Mm-hmm. So rest has this deeply countercultural thing. Yeah. Maybe one of the reasons our society doesn't want us to rest is it's worried what will happen if we do. Mm-hmm. That maybe if we all started taking rest, and I mean real rest. I don't mean this sort of, well, now I'm not being paid, I'm just going to do something else equally intense. Yeah. But I realize you guys have talked about Sabbath already, but I think Sabbath is that rest from producing, just sort of the time where you can just be, and to realize that has value. And once you start to find that sense of value in just being, you start to remember who it is that you actually are.
Yeah, and I think the other facet that's so important about rest is that it reminds us who we are, but it also reminds us who everybody else is. And it reminds us the value of each unique person within the culture in which we find ourselves. And being in constant movement and momentum, and particularly production-related momentum, in which we measure ourselves against what we're producing at work or at school or whatever it is. One of the challenges of that is not only to what it does to our sense of ourselves, but also everyone else becomes a product of this machine. I sound a little bit Marxist now. What I mean by that is that everybody becomes a product of this constant movement in which we don't just measure ourselves that way, we measure everybody that way. And that's quite a beautiful thing about this Jesus who comes and finds constant pockets and carves out intentional moments to rest and be attentive to who he is before God. That the other thing that constantly turns up, particularly in Mark's gospel, is Jesus is always being interrupted, which is really strange because he has such a busy schedule. He has so much to get done. And in a sense, you can say that Jesus' schedule just has one thing on it, which is get to the cross. And he seems to constantly be setting his attention towards traveling to Jerusalem. But on the way to doing this most important thing in human history, he lets himself be stopped constantly. And there's something tied up, and I found this always in my own experience, in which when I haven't created Sabbath moments to rest and just be, it's not just my sense of myself that suffers, it's my sense of everybody else. Oh, yeah. Everybody else becomes something that maybe I can manipulate, and that sounds very negative, but unconsciously manipulate in order to produce more stuff. Everybody becomes something that I can use to further my own agenda, rather than someone who, when they turn up, inviting me to interrupt my agenda, I get to say, actually, maybe God is here. Maybe the God that I encounter in my rest is the same God that I encounter here in this person who's inviting me to stop the schedule for a moment.
Let me just do some really terrible example of what you should never do when you're on stage, but I'm just thinking through the Gospels as you talk, and so I'm going to say something that somebody might want to point me out as being wrong, but I can't think of a situation in the Gospels where Jesus, this has just come to me just right now, so this might not be as good a thought as I think it is, but I can't think of a situation in the Gospels where Jesus asks the question that we almost ask everybody second, right, which is, so what do you do? Right? Hi, who are you? I'm Adam, I'm David. And then our next question in most meetings is, and what do you do? Which is a really fascinating question to ask if you think about it. Why are we so interested in what you produce? We're almost wired to, it's really hard, it's a good conversation starter. I can't think of a situation where Jesus asks anyone what they do. And what's fascinating by that is once you ask someone what they do, that starts to govern and shape your perception of them, but it also governs and shape the next series of questions. And it almost strikes me that it's really helpful that Jesus doesn't ask that question, because often the things he says to people are really awkward things based on what they do. So a guy comes to Jesus and Jesus says, "Oh, you should totally give away all your money," right? Well, like, and this guy was a rich man, and that was his thing, was his money. He comes to Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus decides that he needs to give away all of the stuff he's robbed before he even encounters Jesus. But it strikes me, and this goes right the way back to Sabbath, and you've said it already, but this constant reminder of Sabbath that, that maybe we could even be as bold to say that the one being in history that is not interested in what you do is God. That you can have a day off. Because in some sense, this commitment to what we do, the machine, let's both sound like Marxists for a second, it's a form of slavery.
Yeah.
You're enslaved to it, and that was Israel's story.
Yeah.
And that's what's so beautiful about Sabbath. Like I grew up in a very legalistic culture, and Sabbath was this very legalistic thing. Unfortunately, our response in the church to that has been to say, wow, that was really legalistic, and we've thrown it out.
Yep.
No, we don't do that anymore. And the sad truth of that is we missed what was beautiful.
Yeah.
That was a God saying to all of us, actually you have inherent value, which is why the church, I think, can be such a beautiful space, because what you do shouldn't actually matter here. You should be as welcome and joined into conversation, whether you do something or nothing, or whether the world thinks that your something is better than my something. And I think that's an aspect of rest where, it's really quite beautiful to say that what you do isn't the most important thing about you. And I think a lot of our stresses would be much easier to handle if we could believe that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think that's a good place to move into our time of questions. So hopefully we've got some stuff coming in. Encourage you guys to keep texting in if you can. This is the only chance I give you to be on your phone in church, in case you didn't realize. So make the most of it. Check Instagram while you're there. But let's see if we've got any questions coming in. Jared, we got a question that we can talk about. Let's see. How do you talk to people who suffer with depression without offering cheap answers or making them feel worse? I think that's a question that whether we know we need to ask it, we all need to ask it. At some point in our lives, we'll come across people who suffer with mental health issues. And because there's such a stigma around it in our culture, it's very, very hard for us to know how to broach it. We aren't taught how to deal with these kind of things. As someone who, without being too vulnerable necessarily, but someone who, as you said, has wrestled with pieces like anxiety, how have you learned through your own experience to talk to people with some of these mental health issues?
So I think that in one sense, actually, and I don't want to offer a cheap answer to a very important question, but let me offer, as a starter, quite a simple answer. And some people are uncomfortable with this language, so, and I know psychologists that are uncomfortable with this language, but just for sake of, an answer, let me just phrase it. If you think about depression as an illness, right, and think about it as a real illness, then actually this is not quite so scary a thing, right? So let's imagine the question I'd just been asked was, how do you talk to people who suffer from cancer without offering cheap answers or making them feel worse, right? Well, some of the things we say to people who struggle with depression, and some people with depression don't like to refer to mental illness. They prefer to talk about their mental health and so on. And I understand that, and I don't like the stigma of, being referred to as somebody with a mental illness. It's not nice. But it strikes me that a lot of the things that we say to people with depression that are hurtful are because we're saying things that we would never say to someone else who struggled with perhaps more medically accessible illness or a more physical illness, right? And so people with depression will often say that what's hurtful is when people don't take it seriously, So when people say, it's just like, you're just feeling a bit sad, you need to get over it, or the very common, like, what have you got to be sad about? As if, which is, you change the language, right? What have you got to have cancer about? Like, what a ridiculous sentence, Like, I can't believe that someone as rich as you would have cancer. Like, that's we're now into idiocy at some level, but yet we say that quite commonly, well, I can't believe that someone as successful as you would be depressed, as if people have chosen this, as if people have decided, this is something they can take on. So I'm personally, and I'm not a psychologist, but I personally think that when we realize that this is not chosen, that this is not something that a person has elected, it's something that's come upon them, then that actually will naturally filter the questions you might have. So again, like if I had a buck for every time somebody said to me, like, if you've got depression, just go for a run, because somebody somewhere has said, actually, exercise is good for people with depression. Now, here's the annoying thing. Exercise is good for people with depression, right? There is one thing that we know categorically, that actually cardiovascular exercise does something to people with depression. It doesn't solve it, right? But it does help. The problem is, when you're suffering from an extreme bout of depression, going outside is something that's beyond some of us. So when we start throwing in our solutions, for me, something that's really important, I said at the start of our series this year, we have to decide as friends of people whether our friendship is based on them getting better, or whether our friendship is based on something else. You may have a friend that has depression. They need your care. Not your patronizing care, but your actual care, that you would care for them. But that care will, put it this way, that care will be far more real if it's not predicated on them also getting better. So you have to decide, what's my aim with our friendship? Is it cure, or is it care? And for me, it's important that as a church we say, it's care, right? Some people will get better from depression, some people won't, So that would be that maybe that answer is more complex than I'm thinking, but I think if we take it seriously, I think cheap answers and bad answers come ultimately from, and this is part of the reason why it's still a stigma, is there's a lot of people out there, despite the fact that in the Western world 1 in 4 people have some form of depression, there's still a lot of people out there that think it's kind of made up and not real. And then, to be totally frank, we then in the Christian world, you have Christians out there who believe that Christians shouldn't suffer from it. Somehow being a Christian gives you this kind of blanket cover. So it is possible that the church generally could even be a worse place to deal with these sort of issues. Now, hopefully, one of the things we're wrestling at Westside is that isn't what we are. But you part of the reason it's so difficult to admit to having depression is that what will people think? Will people think I'm just making it up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true way beyond just mental health issues, that a great rule of life is treat everybody as if you're not trying to solve their problems for them.
Totally.
Treat everybody as if this is a problem that together you want to talk about, and it isn't a problem that they are inviting you to solve, even if you feel like you know the solution. That's where easy, cheap answers come in, and I think that's very true, because generally people come in, I would think and I would hope with quite a good heart to say, if you just exercise more, you'll feel better. What they really mean is, oh, you didn't know. You didn't know the solution. Oh, well, here it is. And actually, perhaps the person who's suffering with those kind of questions is not really looking for an easy solution. Maybe they're looking for someone who will care instead of trying to cure. And doubtless, I think it's usually a good reminder for ourselves to say, let's just assume that I'm not the first person that has heard this information. And the hope of their cure rides on my giving them the right answer. I think that's very true. I wonder if we have any other questions, Jared. We have another one ready to go. Mental illness seems to have a significant impact on people's feelings and emotions. What is the role of emotions in the life of Christ followers? That's a deep question. What is the role of emotions in the life of Christ followers?
There's a lot to that question. In one sense, I think that there's a tendency, and I'm trying to always think with the questions, you're trying to read between the lines of a question and hopefully then answer the question appropriately. I think there's sometimes been a tendency to try and perceive Christians as kind of these non-emotional beings. And I wonder if sometimes that comes from our Protestant tendency to want to be certain about everything. And emotions are like jello. They're kind of hard to predict. Most of us would say that our emotions are, they surprise even ourselves sometimes. Something happens that you would expect a particular response from. I don't know about you, but I've had this, that, I'll go into particular, I've done funerals, where I thought I would find it really difficult and have found that it's gone quite straightforward. And then I've found myself, in other contexts where I've become overwhelmed by emotion when I thought I was going to be okay. Our emotions sneak up and sort of affect all of us. It strikes me, and you're trying to tie this into the conversation about mental illness, I'm relatively persuaded by Aaron Beck's theory about life, which is essentially to say that it's not what happens to us that is significant. It's how we interpret what has happened to us. So, and that to me is where our emotions start to become connected to, is that what we think of and how we understand what's happened to us can have huge bearings then on how our emotions work and how we feel about things. And so when it comes to following Jesus, I think that there is both the healthy side of the emotions and the non-healthy side of the emotions. So I've had, this to sound really cold, I've had Christians say to me sometimes, I just don't feel like God loves me. As a pastor, your response is to be caring, kind, and helpful with someone like that. Sometimes I want to reply, well, it doesn't really matter whether you feel God loves you or not. He does. That's not an emotional response of God. That's a nature of his being and who he is. But the other sense of the time, we see Jesus so often in his ministry moved by people. There's this beautiful Greek word that is often used of Jesus, which, depending on what form you use it in, the word is splanchnid. Jesus, when he sees people at quite a regular time, the Greek word talks about how he was moved in his splanchnid. Splanchnid literally means intestines. I'm trying not to think about Jesus too much about that. But we often translate it, he was moved in his heart. Yeah. But the Greek people saw that the seat of your emotions was actually your intestines, which makes a lot of sense for me, actually. That nervous butterfly, need to run to the bathroom, that sort of thing. That we see the gospel writers talking about Jesus. Sometimes a situation is such that actually it's his emotions that move him. There's times where, the feeding of the 5,000 story is a classic example of that. Jesus is kind of about his business, doing the things that he does. And all of a sudden people say, hey, there's all these people and they've got nothing to eat. And Jesus can almost appear slightly dismissive of this until he looks at them. And the text literally says, and he's moved in his splanchnid. And he decides, okay, we're going to do something about this. So I wouldn't want to underplay the importance of our emotions. But I want to throw in Beck's theory to say, let's always try and beware that our emotions are an interpretive thing. They will be the result of how we're making sense of the situations that we find ourselves in. So they can be misleading.
It goes for particularly the conversation around mental illness. It's a thing that Jesus followers, Christians, desperately hate to hear, that you are subject to things that are beyond your control. And I think the reason that we don't like to hear that is because we follow the God who strides above the storms, who stills the storms of life. We talked about it last Sunday, actually, here at the platform. That actually the story about Jesus stilling storms may in one sense be a story about the power that he and his followers have over the elements of life. On the other hand, it might also be a story about why is it that Jesus can sleep through a storm and have absolutely no concern about keeping the water out of the boat. And those are very, very different things. They have a profoundly different implication for emotional health, mental health as Christians, because we find it very hard to believe that we're subject to things that are beyond our control, and that whether we like it or not, they will remain beyond our control. And emotions are often far beyond control, particularly the strongest emotions. And if we bring mental health into that same piece, then it's very true to say, what would it look like for a Christian to say, yeah, I struggle with depression, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better, and I seek to follow Jesus in this. Rather than, I'm a Christian, so I struggle with depression, but I'm just waiting until God takes control over it. Those might be different expectations, and I've had so much experience around Christians who have been fed very churchy, cheap answers to mental health that says, no, your God is the one who does stride above the storms, and if he hasn't healed you yet, don't worry, he will. And actually, we need to learn how to say, there are things that affect my life that are beyond my control, and that I need to learn to follow Jesus within rather than wait until they pass before I can, really learn to walk with Jesus.
I think it's probably important as well to throw into that your emotions and how they react are often happening in tandem with what's going on in your head. And so the difficulty that people with mental health illnesses, forgive me for using that term again, have is you're constantly having to make interpretive decisions that a person who doesn't struggle with mental health doesn't have to make. So the problem is, and this is perhaps helpful for people that are on the outside looking in, if you live with depression, for example, you're interpreting life in a particular way. The difficult bit is that it's probably not true, right? That your brain is telling lies to yourself. And a person with anxiety has an incredible ability to imagine what can go wrong in any situation. And it potentially even know that what they're imagining is not true. Yeah. But the physiological responses, the emotional responses are absolutely real. So if you invent something that you're afraid of in your head's doing that for you, or if you invent something to be depressed about in your head, the difficult thing is that most people wake up to the feeling after the lie starts. So by the time you become aware of how you're feeling, it's too late for you to process, wait a minute, this isn't real. This is just my feelings now messing with you. So the difficulty is you encounter somebody who's in the midst of an anxiety attack, for example, or a bout of manic depression. The things that you might say, like, it's not real, you're just making this up, that they are even able to assess that you're speaking truth to them. The problem is the emotional roller coaster has now started. So the emotions are absolutely real. Yeah. And that's the interesting bit about how we follow Jesus in that sense, is we like to think that he controls our emotions, but the mental health is way more complex than that, because actually the stuff going on in your head that, especially this is why we need therapists and counselors, because sometimes it takes other people who really know what they're talking about to help you come to terms with what are the lies and what are the truths that are causing these emotional feelings. Yep,
that's great. So let's have two more questions, maybe one for us to wrestle with and then one to talk about around our tables. How can we recognize or become aware of the root cause of some of these issues that we face in life? How can we face and work through these issues? Sometimes people text me 2 questions as a cheat, that's fine. How can we recognize or become aware of the root cause of some of these issues that we face in life, and how can we face and work through these issues? I mean, we talked a little bit about this around why we live in such a burnout culture and how we begin to respond to that. Maybe as we kind of come towards the end of our conversation tonight, we can ground that in this piece of how do we actually find space to rest? Maybe if it's okay with whomever you are, me amending your question a little bit, how do we actually find space to practice the kind of things that we've talked about? It can be very airy-fairy. We can hear it in church and say you just need to carve out a day a week in which to take this Sabbath moment and rest, and it's pretty well impossible to do. It's pretty well impossible to take a whole day of not producing anything, let alone not producing stuff for work or the various things that you have to do. So how can we even begin to make steps in that direction, do you think?
I want to answer that. I want to speak very briefly to this question directly as well. Is that okay? Am I allowed to?
It is okay.
If I can speak that.
Imagine if I said no.
Yeah,
that would have been so awkward for all of you, wouldn't it?
Let me, rather than trying to answer, because that is a complex question, but let me ask a question back. Right, which I think is a question to all of us, not just the person that asked that question. 2 questions you might want to ask yourself. One might be, what would be the most shameful thing that you could imagine happening to yourself, right? And then perhaps then, off the back of that question, ask some questions about your own vulnerability. I was thinking about that a lot over the last couple of weeks, about how would you define vulnerable, and what would vulnerability look like for you, right? And I think if you were to take the time and ask those questions, what would be really shameful for me? Yeah. And what would it look like for me to be vulnerable? Your own personal answers to that question, my suspicion is, and I don't mean this as some sort of magic trick, but my suspicion is that those questions will get you very close to this question about the root cause, right? What is it that's driving me to be affected by these particular issues? At the basis of it somewhere, there will be a shame response. There'll be something that we can't imagine having to live if we were like this. So, why do we keep pursuing? Like I told the story this morning of the suicide of a Calgary businessman a few months ago. And, and this man, with all of the apparent success of the world, still found himself pursuing pills and alcohol and ultimately became suicidal in that. My suspicion is that underneath this, something was driving him that he couldn't admit to. Yeah. If anybody else knows about this, then my whole life will be too embarrassing. And therefore, I'll put myself through 7 shades of hell rather than admitting it. And whatever that thing is, and I think it'd be different for everyone, but if you could find that thing, that'll be the root cause. And sometimes I've met really successful businessmen that literally have got themselves into a real mess. And when I sat down and spoke to them, I realized this guy is working, I'll do this anonymously, but I met a guy once, it became very apparent that this guy was working so hard because he just wanted his father to tell him he was proud of him, and this guy had more money than you and I could imagine having, but he wasn't satisfied because the thing he was looking for was never going to happen because his father had died, so this root cause was destroying him. His family life was falling apart, his friendships were falling apart, but he was on this path to prove something to somebody that couldn't be done.
And of course, what's interesting about the story that you shared this morning of the Calgarian businessman who took his own life is that often when we hear those kind of stories, particularly in the news and social media, they will be prefaced by, despite having everything one could want, he suffered with mental health issues. And that really is an interesting piece to this question, that the root cause does not necessarily, or perhaps not at all, go hand in hand with the fact that you should be really content. That saying to someone, as you said, you have nothing to be depressed about makes no difference, in exactly the same way that it should not be a surprise that somebody who seemingly has everything that they have ever dreamt of having still suffers with very, very significant mental health issues. And we seem to always want to separate those two out. If only I had this, then this emotional response that I have to my life would pass, because it's actually circumstantial.
And of course, actually, curiously, and it sounds like such a cold word to say, but curiously, the inverse is actually true. The statistics tell us that it is actually more likely that the highly successful people, so I read a statistic this morning that highly successful businessmen are 5 times more likely to kill themselves than the general population. So strangely enough, I would want to push to say that our society is so broken, our perception of success is so unattainable, that actually the closer you get to this so-called success, the more dangerous it becomes. Your likelihood for depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts are actually higher. But that does relate to your question about rest, because if you can identify the root cause, if you can find out what is it that's driving you, and that can be a scary journey, by the way, to actually ask yourself the questions. Think about, some psychologists will take you on an exercise where they'll ask you to imagine the thing you're most scared of happening. And then once you've imagined that thing, they might ask you, so, why is that so scary? And that process and the answers we give to then keep asking, and why is that scary, will slowly lead us towards what it is that's ultimately driving. So oh my goodness, I'm going to fail my exams. Okay, well, that's actually not such a big deal, right? So why are you so scared of that? Well, if I fail my exams, my family will be embarrassed about me. Okay, so why is that such a big deal to you? And you can actually track your way through to try and get to the root cause. I feel like as close as we can get to asking ourselves what's really driving us is necessary for us to then figure out how to rest from it. So this is why I think you're right. Rest is so difficult for us, but because we're trying to prove something. I'm convinced that many of us are trying to prove something to someone. And the reason we're often making such a mess of our lives is because we don't know who the someone is, and we don't know what the something is that will prove it to them. But if we could start to ask ourselves some really deep soul-searching questions about what's driving me, that then becomes the thing we need to rest from. So from one person, literally, for some people, it might just be switching off social media for a day a week. That might be really healthy for them. For another person, it might be turning off their phone. For someone else, it might be just having a day off that doesn't involve adventure sports. That my day is just going to be a walk. My day is just going to be, dinner with my girlfriend.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I think rest, I think we can be creative with it. At some level, you need a day where you can step away from the thing that's driving you, come back 24 hours later and realize that it didn't all fall apart without you.
Yeah.
That actually, the world's still there. There's a huge arrogance in us, actually. We don't like to say it like that, that believes that we're that important, that if our phone isn't on, and if we don't answer that particular Facebook post or Facebook, who am I kidding? Who uses Facebook that's under 40?
Just you and I
yeah,
think, of everyone in the room, yeah.
I
believe it's called Snipchat. Is that right? That was a joke, guys. I know it's called Snapchat. That's really embarrassing.
My friend's son asked him the other day what's this Facebook? Is it like Instagram for old people?
Yes,
and it's exactly what it is. And, I was talking to someone last night who said, I realized Facebook was over when my mom joined. But
I think once parents started stalking their kids, that's when Instagram
true.
was born, yeah.
But anyway, the point being that I think you can be creative with your rest, is what I'm saying. The core of it is to step away from the thing that's driving you, to step away from the thing that might even be driving you crazy at some level. Not that crazy is a mental diagnosis, but, that thing that drives you, can you step away from it? And if you can't, then you've got a problem. We can make all the excuses we want, but if you can't go 24 hours without checking your social media, if you can't go 24 hours without your phone being switched on, now you've got a problem with it, and that's why you need rest. Jesus knew he had a problem. I can keep healing people all day long. There'll be no end to the people that heal me, that need me to heal them. So now the question comes, can I step away from this? And if you can, that's when I think you find your rest.
Sure. No, that's fantastic. I think that's a great place to close. Let's thank David together for coming out and giving us this evening. Yeah, I should have warned you in advance that you were coming to look at two British people have a chat. So we were going to be here for a while, you know what I mean? That's why I didn't tell you, actually. But David, thanks so much for joining us. And this has been, I think, a really important conversation for us at the platform as we launch into this new project, to say that we want to be a community that is a safe place for uncomfortable questions, that wrestles through things that you often don't hear about in church. And we are blessed to be a part of a community at Westside that also has the same vision, right? We want to talk about stuff that is tough to talk about, even though it's tough. And so I'm going to leave you guys as we close our service together. Please feel free to take off if you need to get home, have a safe drive, enjoy the cold. But I would encourage you to stick around and wrestle through this piece around your tables. Maybe we can write it on the screen. Just what we were asking just here, what is that thing in your life that actually is at the root cause? Maybe you don't want to go really deep and personal, and that's okay too, but just think about it, reflect on that. What is that thing that might be at the root cause of some of my stress and some of my exhaustion and tiredness? And how can I help to actually make small steps in the right direction to moving through that? So I encourage you guys to stick around, wrestle through this. We want to be a conversational community and to learn together. So I encourage you to stick around, but if you have to take off, feel free to do so. And we hope to see you next Sunday.